Welcome to this mental health series of classes. I'm really glad that you're here. In this class, we're going to discuss some very difficult things. And if you feel overwhelmed by emotion, that's okay. It's normal and probably even a good thing. It means you are starting to deal with those pent up emotions. So, take your time, stop the class at any time, and come back when you're ready. Merriam-Webster defines grief as deep and poignant distress caused by or as if by bereavement. We're going to talk about bereavement in a minute. According to medicinenet.com, grief is the normal process of reacting to loss. Now, the loss may be physical, such as death, or social, such as divorce, or occupational, such as a job. Now, I can personally attest to the grief that it comes from losing a job that you love. If you want to hear my story on that, go to my blog and click on my Start Here page. Grief can be a very deep and sorrowful emotion. Physiologically speaking, it is a powerful emotional and physical reaction to the loss of someone or something. Grief is not simply bereavement. Please understand that bereavement is specifically defined as the loss of a loved one. It cannot apply to any other kind of loss or grief. All right, these are only a few examples of what can cause the emotion of grief. Losing a job, a significant change in lifestyle or financial status, a stillbirth or a miscarriage, ending of a friendship, romantic relationship, or a marriage, serious illness or disease in yourself or someone you love, losing your physical mobility or independence, going through the experience of being robbed or a burglary, anything that might make you feel unsafe, an automobile accident or another near-death experience. Grief can also be caused by the loss of a personal dream or a beloved pet. Basically, it's anything that you deem the loss of anything that's important to you can create feelings of grief. And when you are unable to cope with that grief over a long period of time, you may be at risk for a grief disorder. And we're going to discuss that next. In the mental health world, they define grief in two ways: normal versus complicated. So for our purposes, we're going to use the definitions from verywellhealth.com. The term normal and complicated are used for these different types of grief. In this situation, normal means more common or an expected type of grief. It does not mean it is right or good. On the other hand, complicated grief does not mean bad. Normal grief describes the feelings that people have in the first few weeks or months after a loss. It can include things like crying, being angry, not having interest in your regular activities. This type of grief will get better with time as people learn how to cope with that loss. Now, complicated grief, on the other hand, is not bad. It's just different. It's a different kind of grief than many people have. This type of grief can be very intense and sometimes last a very long time. A person with complicated grief might end up needing more support to help them understand what they're feeling and help to move through the grieving process. Now, most people have one or more experiences of grief in their lifetime. And in the days or weeks or even months right after that grief, that we go through that loss, that's called the normal stage of grief. And these are some of the common things people experiencing in normal grief: crying or sobbing, changes in your sleep pattern, meaning having difficulty falling asleep, or sometimes sleeping way too much or not sleeping enough, an overall lack of energy, feeling lethargic or apathetic about things that you need to do, about your life in general, changes in appetite, being on both extremes, eating way too much or eating not enough eating, sometimes consuming a ton of comfort food. Also, we can withdraw from our usual social interactions and relationships, having difficulty concentrating on something at work or school or a hobby, questioning your spiritual or religious beliefs, um, having difficulties in your career or job choices, changing in your life goals, feeling angry, guilty, lonely, depressed. Sometimes you feel empty, probably sad. And I could continue this list, but overall, if you have normal grief, you could feel all those things. But what defines it as normal is that occasionally, as the weeks and the months pass, you will occasionally experience moments, even if it's just one blip of a moment, you'll still feel some joy and happiness in some things. Now, getting into complicated grief. Some people experience complicated grief without being at fault, any fault of their own. It's just a response. It could be a response to the death of a loved one. And sometimes that grief doesn't fade over the weeks or months after. Instead, it keeps someone from getting back to what their normal life used to be. Sometimes you might hear complicated grief defined as abnormal grief, chronic grief, complicated grief disorder, exaggerated grief, pathological grief, persistent complex bereavement disorder. Now, some of the characteristics of complicated grief can include extreme anger or irritation, episodes of rage, inability to focus on anything but the death of a loved one or the pinpoint of that created grief, focusing intensely on reminders of the deceased or excessive avoidance of such reminders, intense feelings of pain, sadness, detachment, sorrow, and hopelessness, extreme emptiness, creating low self-esteem in the person who's grieving, bitterness, longing for the deceased person's or the pinpoint of the grief, longing for the presence of the creation of the grief, problems accepting the reality of the person's death, and ending up perhaps in your own self-destructive behavior. Now, we're going to talk about self-destructive coping mechanisms in a few minutes. It's commonly agreed in the mental health community that there are 5 stages one needs to go through to attend to their grief. Now, although there are some out there who will say that there are 7 and others 12 stages of grief, but for the purpose of this class, we're going to go with the generally accepted 5 stages. Okay, denial. When you first learn of this loss, when you first recognize that you've had a loss and it's creating the grief, it's normal to think this is not happening. You may feel shocked or numb. This is a temporary way to deal with a rush of overwhelming emotion. It's a defense mechanism. So that's denial. The second step in the 5 stages of grief would be anger. So now reality is going to set in, and you're faced with this pain of your loss. You may feel frustrated and helpless. These feelings later turn into anger. You might direct it toward other people, a higher power, or just life in general. To be angry with a loved one who died and left you alone is very natural. Now, when my birth father died unexpectedly, I was extremely angry for years and years, and I pulled away from many people in my life that pertained to him. Bargaining. During this stage, you might dwell on what you could have done to prevent the loss. Common thoughts are, if only I had XYZ, and what if I had done that? Or what if I had said that? You may also try to strike a deal with your higher power, your deity, the creator of your life. The next step would be depression. Sadness sets in as you begin to understand the loss and its effect on your life. Signs of depression include crying, sleeping issues, and a decreased appetite. You may feel overwhelmed, regretful, and even lonely. The last step in this process is called acceptance. In this final stage of grief, you can accept the reality of your loss. It can't be changed. Although you still feel sad, this is the point where you decide that you might be able to start moving forward with your life. Now, sometimes these stages of grief don't go in this order. And again, that's okay, because grief is different for everyone. This is important, but why? Grief allows us to let go of the energy which is bound to the lost person or object or experience. Grieving is not forgetting. No, some things we go through will never, never be far from our mind's eye. But this process can give us a sense of peace where there was not any peace before. So, open those floodgates and let those emotions roll out of you. So, I alluded to this earlier in the class. When you're in deep emotional pain, it can be extremely tempting to try to numb your feelings with drugs, alcohol, food, or even throw yourself into enormous allotments of work. Now, that might be work in the physical sense. Maybe you throw yourself into the gym and you get lost in classes and extreme exercise. Maybe you get lost at your work in your office. But I implore you, be careful. These are temporary escapes, and they won't make you heal faster, and they certainly won't make you feel better in the long run. In fact, they can lead to addiction, terrible depression, create anxiety, and even an emotional breakdown. Drugs and alcohol are anesthetics and analgesics, meaning many different substances like alcohol and opiates can numb your pain. But searching for an external way to heal an internal pain will always be temporary. Whether you choose sex, drugs, gambling, risk taking, thrill seeking, spending, or other forms of self sabotage, they will only ever be temporary. They can only heal your pain for a short amount of time. Extended isolation is also a coping mechanism. And sometimes people can stop taking care of themselves. I myself chose that one. I stopped taking care of myself and I ended up in a deep depression. Now, from a study at Harvard University, this is is what was suggested from the study. If you want to help someone to grieve, these are some suggestions from Harvard study. Don't give up. You can't take away the pain from someone who is grieving, but your mere presence is more important than it seems. If you can accept and understand that you can't fix the situation and you can't make your friend or loved one feel better, but instead just be present, offer hope and a positive outlook toward the future. Try some small gestures, sending a card or a flower, delivering a meal, helping out with their laundry or shopping, or just make a regular date to stop by, just to listen and hold their hand. Maybe you offer them support during holidays. Ask them specifically, is there anything I can do to help you mark this holiday? Mark the loss during this occasion. In the case of a death, saying the person's name and how much you'll miss that person is so much better than saying the perfunctory, I'm sorry for your loss. And certainly, please, please don't ask, how are you? Instead, try, I'm so glad to see you. Or, how are you feeling today? But then you have to stop. You have to wait for their answer and really listen. Listen instead of give advice. And above all, above everything else, avoid judgment. Remember, grieving is personal and everyone does it differently. According to Talkspace.com, cognitive behavioral therapy for grief works by helping you become aware of your negative thought patterns. Acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, uses mindfulness to help you process grief and accept loss. This type of therapy can be used for prolonged or complicated grief that lasts for a year or more after a loss occurs. ACT, or ACT, helps you reprocess a loss emotionally. It also helps you begin to process any emotions you might have been avoiding dealing with. Traumatic grief therapy allows you to process a sudden trauma related grief, for example, losing a loved one unexpectedly. This form of therapy looks at trauma response and the grief that's associated with a traumatic, usually unexpected death. CGT, or complicated grief therapy, involves learning to address the symptoms of complicated grief. CGT often includes acceptance and commitment therapy. Group therapy is also an option. Often groups are made up of people who are recovering from similar experiences. Support groups can offer a brave and safe place for you to share and heal in a confidential, supportive, and loving environment. Now there's art therapy, and art therapy uses creativity to promote healing and help you process your grief. It can support, improve, and restore functioning and a sense of well-being. The idea behind art therapy is the belief that artistic and creative self-expressions can have a healing effect on us. And the last one is play therapy. Now, play therapy is often used with children, but it involves the use of imaginative or other types of play to help process grief. Give yourself time. Time to go through the grieving steps, time to process. Accept your feelings and know that grieving is a process and it's going to take time. You can try talking to someone you trust. You can spend time with friends and family. Sometimes, directly after something occurs to cause grief, you want time alone, and that is normal. But an extended period of isolation can turn into being very unhealthy. So be mindful of that. Self-care or self-love, so important. Do something that's just for yourself, something that will revitalize you, fill your spirit, lift you. Exercising regularly, eating well, and getting enough sleep can raise those natural endorphins in your mind and help guide you onto a path of recovery. Try to return to a hobby or find a new one. Get back to the activities that bring you joy. Find a support group. It will help you speak to others who are also grieving. It can help you feel more connected. When I lost my third child, I felt an overwhelming sense of grief. And I withdrew. But when those around me understood what was happening, they reached out to me and kindly shared their own experiences. And when they did that, they made me feel like I was not alone. And it helped me to start me on a path of recovery. It's going to take internal emotional work to heal your emotional pain. If you've gone through the steps of grieving, but you can't seem to feel better, or you cannot seem to find a way to complete the steps of grieving on your own, you may want to consider professional help. Also, consider these things. Are you having trouble keeping up with your normal routine? Like going to work, cleaning your house, taking care of your children? Do you have feelings of depression? Do you have thoughts that life isn't worth living? Or you feel like harming yourself? Do you have an inability to stop blaming yourself? If any of these things sound true to you, or true to someone around you who is grieving, please consider reaching out to your regular doctor or reaching out to a psychiatrist or a psychologist. I hope you've enjoyed this class. I hope you've learned something important. If you have, please visit my other classes at unshamed.co and then visit my classes and products page. If you're ready to make changes in your own life and you would like someone to coach you along, I'm waiting for you. When you're ready, go to my blog and click the coaching tab. You can also find me on these social media sites. Feel free to email me with any questions you have. And make sure to reference my resources pages on my blog. If you go to my homepage, you'll see one for mental health, one for self-care, and one for healthy living. Here you're going to find many offers, both fun and helpful. You'll notice in each of the slides on the bottom right corner, you're going to see numbers, and those numbers correspond to each of these sources. Feel free to copy and paste these into your browser and you can read more fully. On a recent journey I made on the path of self-care for myself, I came across this gorgeous image of the sleeping lady. Some also call her Mount Susitna, in all her winter glory, lying in wait for her lover to return from war. This is her way to grieve. We all grieve in our own way, even Mother Nature.